afternoon, folks, and welcome back to the farm. Today we're in the greenhouse. We're going to talk a little bit about food security and some shortages and a little bit of preparedness. But first, I feel I left a question unanswered in yesterday's video. I was talking about egg production in chickens and the molt and things you can do to spur on egg production. And one of our viewers actually asked the question and said, well, maybe we missed this, but did you actually comment on really what's the longevity or the expected lifespan for a producing hen? And you know what? Despite that being 100% the context of the video, completely missed that part. And so I did a bit of a disservice to everybody that was probably watching that one. So good rule of thumb, if you get a laying hen, whether you hatch it out yourself or you get it from a hatchery, should start laying anywhere from 18 to 36 weeks. Over its first year laying period, you should get approximately 250 eggs, and you will see that decline by approximately 15% every year, right up until year 6 or 7, at which point it is a good time to retire your hen. Now, that doesn't mean that the life expectancy of the hen itself is 6 to 7 years. In fact, there's many documented cases of hens living to 8, 9, 10 years old quite happily. In fact, I think the longest living chicken on record, domesticated chicken living on record, was named Matilda, and I'm pretty confident she lived to like 16 years old. Of course, not laying up until she was 16 years old, but living quite a happy life. Anyways, enough about chickens. Well, maybe not enough about chickens. We'll circle back to chickens. Food security, food shortages, should we panic, should we not panic? So a couple weeks ago, I put a survey out on our community page on YouTube and just asked the question, hey, how do you feel about this? And, some folks said, I feel pretty good. I think we're going to get by. Some folks said, I'm a little concerned. And that's really what the majority of the crowd was, right? Kind of in the middle, either I'm a little concerned or I think I'm going to be okay. And then on the opposite ends of the spectrum where it's like, holy cow, I'm panicking. This is going to get real bad. Very few people on that end of the spectrum. And likewise on the complete opposite end of the spectrum where it's like, no worries. Like, I'm supply chain? What? Like, I am my own supply chain. Very few people sit in that category. Now, in terms of where you should sit in that category, you pretty much should sit on one end or the other. That middle ground, even though the majority of people may have an opinion that believe that, they're led to believe that that's where they're there, or that's where their mind takes them to think that they're there, that middle ground is shrinking. And not in terms of people that are there, but in terms of reality, right? Reality doesn't match what we, currently believe we're in. So there's going to be very few people that don't have a large cause for concern. There's going to be very few people that are just going to get by okay. In fact, what we're going to see is some folks that are completely on the survival wagon that are going to do just fine. And then there's going to be some folks that, they thought they had things figured out and they're going to get a harsh awakening. Now, how is that playing out in current events? Well, today I read a study, that stated that the price of groceries in the average Canadian home is going to increase by $966 a year, contributing to a total average cost of groceries per household of 4 people to about $15,000 per year. Well, we grow a lot of our own food here on the farm. We raise our own pigs. We have our own massive garden. We have all our own chickens. We raise our own lamb. And none of that costs us 15 grand, right? Let's just put that out there. As far as their upbringing and raising costs, right? Now, infrastructure-wise, to manage all that and try and turn a profit, that of course costs us more than $15,000. But how can I make this relevant to the average viewer? Maybe the viewer that's in an urban setting as opposed to a rural setting, or the viewer that has very limited real estate in terms of how much food they can grow and raise and sustain by themselves without having to bring in external resources. Well, I will say the average household, if you look at the average house in town, the backyard, if the backyard is, 30 feet by 50 feet, which is a pretty good sizable backyard, what's that covered in? If it's covered in grass, well, let's end a conversation, right? If it's covered in grass, do something about it, right? Get yourself some boards, build yourself some raised beds, get some compost in there, start growing your own groceries. You would be shocked as to how much food you could grow in 4 raised beds inside your backyard, right? We're here in northern Alberta, right? So we get a very narrow growing window. In fact, we're 90 to 100 days. At 100 days if we're spoiled, which we actually got 110 days this year, and some extreme heat waves that went along with it. So it wasn't all sunshine and roses, but average is about 90 to 100 days. Now, in that 90 to 100 days, we get some very, very long days, right? So we get maximum sunshine exposure. But the remainder of the year, the other 9 months of the year, we're in one of the harshest, most difficult climates to live in, right? It's always cold, it's always windy. Weather conditions are typically always on the extreme side that is not really very conducive to growing. And yet somehow we scratch out a little, and it's not just us. I mean, there's literally thousands, tens of thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands really, of people up here that seem to get by just fine. Now, how much of that is because of self-reliance and how much of that is because of supply chains? Well, if you look at the majority of the urban population, very little when it comes to urban population is actually self-reliant. The majority are entirely reliant on the Walmart, the Superstore, the Safeway of the world. And where we, here locally we have a co-op and we have an IGA in town, and I can't count on one hand, right? I need both hands to count this. How many times I went into that local grocery store and something I needed wasn't available. And it started off with toilet paper, and it went to yeast, and it went to flour, then it went to sugar. Then it's bread, and then it's milk, and then it's something else. And now we're back to toilet paper. We've come full circle, and now there's actually a mill shortage or a mill shut down, and there's actually a legitimate toilet paper shortage now. And somebody up there is thinking, "Oh, see, I told you so." Now they got 400 packs of toilet paper, and they're set for life, but they're going to starve because they won't have any food. But so we're seeing is, in 2022, this report that I read is really forecasting that there's going to be more tribulation to come on top of, just the fact that groceries are going to cost more. It's going to get harder to get them, right? Shipping delays, labor shortages. There's a whole thing on democracy right now. There's a whole global leadership summit happening right now where some eyes are really looking at China and Russia and how they're flexing some pretty heavily communist muscles at Taiwan and the Ukraine, and where is this going to lead? Well, you get into let's just say the last time we did this at the end of a pandemic, it led to a world war, and nobody was any the better for it. And right before the World War, right before, through, and at the end of the World War, we had to deal with mass famine. The Dust Bowl eras in the United States. Things were the dirty 30s, right? Times were tough. And we've had it good for a very, very long time right now. We've definitely been taking full advantage of the 7 fat cows. In fact, so much so that the generation that's currently up for retirement has never actually known hardship in their lifetime. And that's not to say that hardship hasn't existed in the world, right? But there's, the Western world for sure, is the generation that's now in the 65 years old range has never experienced hardship, right? They never experienced the Second World War. They came into the 1940s, 1950s, and through into the 60s where, aside from a blip there in Vietnam where things got a little bit difficult for some folks in the East, largely life has been pretty doggone good for folks in the West. And we're about to get a very rude awakening that the wolves are going to come knocking at our door. So my concern here is, the wolves that knock at our door, for lots of folks, they're not going to have to knock very hard. They're really not. Especially when it comes to things like hardship, because we're just not prepared for it. We've just never experienced it. We're not prepared for it. We're not going to even recognize it when it comes, we're just going to be like, one day we'll just be like, oh shit, where did this go wrong? Like what happened? Things were so fantastic. Everything was great. And now I'm living out of the garbage. If you can even find the garbage. Now, speaking of garbage, this is where it comes into play. The average Canadian household, the average Canadian, not the average Canadian household, the average Canadian will discard 79 kilos of edible food per person per year, contributing to almost 3 million metric tons of food waste in Canada alone every single year. That's pretty concerning, right? Thinking that, we're about to have some skinny cows and we're about to have some real hardship and we're going to have to really tighten up our belts. Well, we'll have no problem tightening up our belts because our waists are going to get real thin here if we don't start pulling up our socks. So, okay, well, how can we manage this? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. Things that are edible foods that can be discarded. Well, maybe we just need to recycle those foods. If they're still edible, why can't we reprocess them back into another system that can then regenerate food? Can I feed them to pigs? Sure. Can I feed them to chickens? Sure. Things that they can't eat, can I compost that and turn it back into soil, which will then feed fruits and vegetables to grow? Sure. Are we on board with that? No. In fact, we have food regulations that don't even allow us to do that. We can't even feed table scraps to chickens. We can't even feed table scraps to pigs. Legally, you can't. There's a whole bunch of rules around sterilizing compost, right? So the fact of the matter, especially with compost, this drives me nuts, right? That there's certain things you can't put in compost, you can't compost down because of the microbial activity, and it's got to be sterilized. And you're essentially putting dead soil in the soil and expecting it to feed the soil. All you're doing is adding dead organic material to the soil. That drives me wild. But that's a whole conversation on soil health for another day. Just keep that one in your pocket for now. So what can you do? What can you do if we're not able to do that? Well, maybe you can petition your municipality to allow you to raise backyard chickens, right? Your backyard chickens can graze on the grass you do have in your yard. You can feed them your own kitchen scraps for your own consumption. Nobody's going to know any the wiser. Nobody's going to care. Except maybe, Karen next door that doesn't like chickens. Well, there again, very small margin of people, right? Soft people make for hard times, and eventually hard times make hard people. So the people that complain about nothing are going to suddenly find themselves excluded from society, or just they're going to have to acclimate in some way, shape, or form, or they're just going to starve to death, right? The time when we can just be offended over completely nonsensical things is over, and the time when we need to actually buckle down and work together and make a difference and actually act as a human race is probably back in 2010 is when we should have started this. In fact, I even remember in the late 80s, early 90s in school hearing about something called Food Mountain. Of course, it's a diagram of a mountain that's, like pizza and carrots and grain and, all the different foodstuffs on it. And it's just a diagram, but it doesn't really mean anything. But what that was forewarning was that there was so much food in the world that was being wasted. And that problem is carried through to today, when in fact our average local grocery store, they're discarding, an average of at least 5 to 7% of their perishable products every single week. So that's their dairy, their bakery, their meats, their produce. They're having to buy extra only to throw it away in the garbage, knowing that they're going to throw it away in the garbage at the end of the week. Well, why don't they just buy 5% less? Well, this becomes a problem with a social issue with consumer demand. If I go to the grocery store to buy one item, chances are I'm probably going to walk out of that grocery store with maybe 2, maybe 3 items, right? But if I go to the grocery store for one item and I look down there and they don't have that one item because they've already sold out, well, I'm certainly not going to buy the second item, and I'm certainly not going to buy the third item. I'm going to go down to the other grocery store, or maybe even to a different town, and I'm going to buy from them. And suddenly I'm just gonna, that other store is gonna fall completely off the radar, because it's supply and demand, right? And if I go there and I constantly go there and they don't have what I need, why would I ever go there again? So they buy more. They buy more to live in excess, so that regardless of who shows up, they've got XYZ product. Even if they have to throw away 5 to 7% of it at the end of the week, their profit margins are better off by contributing to global waste. Now, what does that tally up to be at the end of the year? So in fact, the manufacturing and processing side of the food industry is discarding 4.8 million tons of food per year. Now, when that gets down to the grocery store, what does that look like? Well, that looks like 1.5 million tons of food per year getting discarded from the grocery store. Now, when it gets down to the individual household level, we already talked about that, but what does that really equate to in dollars and cents? Approximately $1,700 per year per household of food out the door that's still edible. That we're throwing away. And I get it. If you know what, you've ate potatoes for the last 3 days and you're just done looking at them and you're just, I can't deal with these anymore, right? Now imagine if you had backyard chickens and you could just feed them that. Or imagine if you had a backyard compost pile that you could compost that and then use it to feed the soil to grow next year's potatoes that you'll probably throw out too. That's not the point. But you see where I'm going with this, right? If we can actually recycle food instead of wasting food, now we're not having to worry about packaging. Now we're not having to worry about processing. Now we're not having to worry about transportation. Now we're not having to worry about our pocketbooks nearly as much. Maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to save the world. Anyhow, that's my rant for the day. I hope you have a fantastic afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow.